Okay, we will get started. Thank you everyone for attending this evening's public engagement session on the Innisfil community planning permit system. A special thank you to Mayor Dolan and members of council who are joining us this evening. My name is Annie Billis and I am a planner with Dylan Consulting. I will be providing a short overview of meeting logistics before passing it on to Kashmira Aurora, policy planner with the town of Innisfil.
And it looks like you're talking, but I'm not hearing it. I'm not sure about others on the call.
Is everybody able to hear me?
Yep.
We can.
I can hear you.
Okay, I will make sure to speak up. Thank you for pointing that out. So for your visual setup, you can click the side-by-side mode at the top of your screen under View Options. And this will show the presenter screen on the left and the speaker on the right. And you can then click Speaker View or Gallery View, depending on your preference. For audio, all participants will be muted when the presenter is speaking, but please feel free to leave your cameras on. Please submit any questions or comments via the chat box or hold on to them until the question and answer period towards the end of the session. And lastly, this session will be recorded and some sections may be posted online for the public. And now I will hand it over to Kashmira.
Thank you so much, Annie. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the public information session of Community Planning Permit Study. I would like to extend my welcome to members of the public, staff, our Mayor Dolan, and members of the council who are attending this session. Please be aware that this session will be recorded and will be saved on the town's YouTube channel, as well as Get Involved page, so you can watch it anytime. We will start with the land acknowledgement and a brief presentation from our consultants. The presentation will mostly cover what is community planning permit study, how the town is using this tool and thinking of expanding this tool to a town-wide CPPS system, and what are the recommendations, followed by a question round. Next slide, please, Annie. Thank you. The town of Innisfil acknowledges that Innisfil is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich indigenous history. The town also acknowledges that this land is the traditional territories of the First Nation of Turtle Island. It is shared between Anishinaabe people of Bosole First Nation, Chippewas of Rama First Nation, and Chippewa of Georgina Island First Nation. And we thank them for generations of stewardship. This meeting place is still the home to many indigenous people, and as settlers, we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The town acknowledges the 4 sacrifices that are the foundation of Canadian society today. We are dedicated to honoring indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. Thank you. Next slide, please. Before moving forward, I would just like to introduce our project team. So from our consultant team, we have David Riley, principal at SGL, and Annie Buell, planner at Dylan Consulting. And from the town side, we have Brandon Correa, manager of planning, Adriana Gressmer, senior policy planner, and myself, Kashmita Arora, policy planner with the town. We also want to acknowledge and thank Mayor Dolan and members of Town Council for attending today's session and showing us your support. With that, I would like to hand over the next slides from here onwards to David to start with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kashmita. Thank you, Annie, for the introductions. And hello, everyone. As Kashmita mentioned, my name is David Riley. I work for SGL Planning and Design. And together with Dillon Consulting, we're working for the town, conducting the community planning permit system study. And for many of you, you will have participated in some sessions that we had last year, if you're on the community advisory committee group, for example, or part of the technical advisory committee, and you will have heard some of what I'm about to say. However, for the members of council here present tonight and members of public, this is actually our first touch point. And it's the beginning of a conversation that we want to continue. And it's an important part to start here to introduce what is a community planning permit system and what the first phase of the study really, where we're at in terms of a recommended approach for going forward into phase 2, and I'll go over that all in the presentation. But just before we start, of course, the town of Innisfil already has a community planning permit system, and that's the RShore. So that applies to lands along the Lake Simcoe shoreline. There's not too many municipalities that have a community planning permit system, and so Innisfil is actually one of the few in Ontario that does have it, and is very I would say forward thinking that way. And really what we're looking at is a potential to expand the community planning permit system in RShore, but on a town-wide basis. And that's really the topic of what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with what is a community planning permit system to give everyone a refresher. So essentially, we can do a short form for CPPS. That's Community Planning Permit System. This is a land use planning tool that's available to all municipalities in Ontario, and the Planning Act sets out the legislation that's required or that's in there that allows municipalities to implement a CPPS. Essentially, a CPPS replaces a municipality's zoning bylaw. So where you have a community planning permit system, there is no zoning bylaw. It's a replacement for that. You may also be familiar with the term development permit system. This is what the community planning permit system used to be called, and development permit system is still a common term, for example, out west in Western Canada. Next slide, please. So essentially, a community planning permit system has the ability to streamline development approvals, and it combines multiple planning processes, including zoning, site plan, and minor variance all into one. It also includes or allows municipalities to tie in matters such as site alteration and vegetation removal. And that is one of the reasons why you can imagine vegetation removal and site alteration are concerns along shoreline areas. So some municipalities in Ontario, prior to moving to a town-wide system, have implemented community planning permit systems along their shoreline. So Lake of Bays is an example that did that. And now they have recently approved a town-wide community planning permit system. Next slide, please. And so how does it differ from a zoning bylaw? And so this slide here shows a comparison. So there's differences with respect to approvals, urban design guidelines, consultation, appeal rights, and approval timelines. So let me just talk about those a little bit. So with respect to approvals, for a zoning bylaw amendment right now, so all zoning bylaw amendments are currently approved by council. Or minor variance applications are approved by the Committee of Adjustment. Site plan approval is currently delegated to staff for approval. So a CPP bylaw combines all of these processes into one, and the municipality has the flexibility in a CPP bylaw to establish classes of approval. For example, a class 1 could be delegated to staff for approval. A class 2, maybe it's more along the lines of a minor variance, could go to a committee, or class 3 could go to council. That's just an example of what different class approvals. So the bylaw can actually establish, and it's quite flexible in the way municipality can set it up on what types of applications would be delegated to staff for approval if they're more in line with the bylaw requirements. With respect to urban design, we know now in the context of zoning bylaw site plan processes, the traditional planning process, urban design guidelines are, they're looked at when making decisions. And essentially they're implemented a little bit more often through the site plan approval phase. Through a CPP bylaw, you can actually more or less bake in urban design guidelines. There's still guidelines into the process, and it's not that the design guidelines become more like regulations or policies. It's that you can actually establish criteria within a community planning permit system that actually is a little bit broader than, say, a minor variance application, where you're really bound to just the 4 tests of the Planning Act that's in a decision maker's mind when deciding if an application is appropriate. You can actually include additional criteria in a community planning permit bylaw that actually ties back a little bit more strongly to urban design guidelines. That's one of the things, and that's different. Public consultation, we know through minor variance applications and zoning bylaw amendments, we require public meetings, public notices sent out. There's a hearing for minor variance applications, and site plan approval, of course, does not include any public consultation. Now, the legislation for community planning permit systems actually does not require mandatory public consultation at all as part of any community planning permit applications. However, in practice, many municipalities have instituted public consultation and public notice requirements for those classes of development applications that do not exactly meet the bylaw standards. So if there's a variance, or whether small or large, there's different levels of public consultation typically that occur, and that's quite flexible. The municipality has that flexibility to establish that. Appeal rights, so any application for a zoning bylaw amendment, of course, can be appealed, including by third parties. So if you're not the landowner or the municipality or the approval authority, you can appeal that decision. For minor variances, that's a little bit different now, where third-party appeals are no longer allowed, and compared to a community planning permit system where only the applicant has the right to appeal any application, there's no third-party appeal rights whatsoever. And the approval timelines is another big difference. So right now, a zoning bylaw amendment can take many months to approve, approximately 3 months, for example. And then often you have to go through a site plan process following a zoning bylaw amendment, which could take another 3 months, for example. Whereas the approval timeline for a community planning permit application is 45 days, and that's a legislated requirement. So that is it's a much shorter time frame. Next slide, please. And so this is a slide that really shows the top half, what the traditional process, planning framework process, looks like now, compared to the bottom half of the slide, which is a community planning permit process. And you can see a colored square along the top that includes, zoning bylaws, minor variance applications, site alteration permits, tree removal permits, and site plan, all as separate items that need to be done before you go for a building permit and then before you actually build the project. Whereas under a CPPS process, all of those items that I just mentioned are combined into one process and looked at holistically. One decision is made, and then you can go immediately to the building permit process. And so it's streamlined in that way. Next slide, please. So some of the benefits I've already touched on is that the combination of the different planning applications, such as zoning amendments, site plan, minor variance, into one approval process really is one of the benefits, is shorter approval timelines from start to finish. It is an option to get housing to market quicker, and we know that the province is really pushing to build many homes in the next little bit. And this is one of the ways that from on the residential side alone might be helpful. It's a way to actually help support local priorities, because you can actually establish as conditions of approval the implementation of certain community benefits for the community, similar in a way that you might do through a site plan application. But of course, now site plan applications are very limited in scope, according to the latest legislation changes and what you can actually address in site plan. None of that has changed for community planning permit systems. You can still address what you could have previously addressed in the site plan approval process through a community planning permit system when it comes to site plan. There's flexibility in allowing municipalities on how conditions are met, and that the bylaw, the way that you implement the bylaw, and this is really, we're getting kind of ahead of ourselves because we're not at the stage where we're creating the bylaw yet, but there's a lot of flexibility in the way a municipality can create the bylaw that works for the municipality and implements conditions that are appropriate based on the geography within the municipality. Really, we think that a community planning permit bylaw really creates certainty and transparency for the community, the landowners and developers, because all of the work that goes into creating the bylaw is really upfront, which is now, it starts now, and getting people involved in this process so that in the end we have a product that everyone is happy with and understands this type of development can happen here, and we know what to expect and how long approvals will take when we as landowners come forward to develop in Innisfil. Next slide, please. So how has the CPPS been used to date? Next slide. So I mentioned that we already have the Our Shore bylaw, which of course applies only to the lands along the Lake Simcoe shoreline. And part of our study actually was taking a close look at Our Shore, which has been in effect since 2019. And we've identified some issues and potential opportunities to improve Our Shore, which is one of the first priorities coming out of this study, but also to take those lessons and apply them on a town-wide basis. So next slide, please. So how does Our Shore and a town-wide community planning permit system fit into the planning framework? So we've got the Planning Act at the top, setting out the planning framework in Ontario. And then there's provincial plans, such as the provincial policy statement and the growth plan. And all plans stemming from that have to be consistent with the provincial policy statement and conform to the growth plan. That may be changing soon. We may just have one document in the next couple of months, but we'll see. Right now, this is our framework. Then we've, of course, have the Simcoe County official plan, and the town of Innisfil official plan has to conform to the county of Simcoe official plan. And then we've got the zoning bylaw in Innisfil and the Our Shore CPPS bylaw. So development applications have to comply with the zoning, might lead to a site plan application or a future minor variance, and then ultimately a building permit. Under the Our Shore process, if you want to undertake development, you have one application. It's a permit application under the community planning permit system. It combines all of those processes into one, and then you go to the building permit stage. So the town-wide Innisfil CPPS would be the same as that process. Next slide, please. So the Our Shore, since 2019, it's the goals really were to ensure a standard development process for all development in the shoreline, really in line with the Lake Simcoe protection plan and protecting shorelines and making sure that the health of Lake Simcoe is a priority, and that is protecting people and property from natural hazards associated with the development, and of course improving water quality and fish habitat. And I mentioned that site alteration and vegetation removal, which is a huge component of development, is something that you can actually regulate through this process. So since our shore was implemented, about just under 250 applications were received. And just for everyone's curiosity, how many of these applications are actually being approved within 45 days? And the answer is approximately half. And so for a landowner, if you were not, if your application, for example, wasn't approved within the 45 days, well, then you have a right to appeal that application before a decision is made. And then that decision goes to the tribunal. However, if you're a landowner and you know, and you're in dialogue with the town and things are moving in the right direction and you're coming to agreements, you know, chances are you're not going to appeal it and you're just going to keep going through the process. But legally, they would have a right to appeal it after 45 days if a decision has not been made. Next slide, please. Approximately half or 5% of the applications received were council variations. So these would be the largest variations that were proposed. So that's actually a small percentage, only 5%. 74% were approved at the class at the staff variation level. So that is where a variation was needed from the bylaw because it didn't quite meet the standards, but it was minor enough that it was a staff variation. And the bylaw actually sets out what those thresholds are. So, and that's flexible too. So a bylaw will say, if you're exceeding this particular provision, say a front yard setback by 20% or less, then staff can consider that. But if you're exceeding it by 20% or more, then that's a council variation, and it has to go for a larger, you know, it has to go to that other decision maker. And 19% were class 3, which essentially means that they meet all bylaw requirements, and just making sure that everything is okay with respect to those site plan related issues, site alteration and vegetation removal. So that's about 1/5 of all the applications. So when we started this project, we also talked about potential refinements to our shore, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago. And we received comments from our advisory committees, but also from staff on ways that we could improve the bylaw. And we heard a lot about making sure that the bylaw is consistent and clear with respect to terminology and definitions. You know, once you implement a bylaw, you know, okay, well, maybe we want to make a few changes here because that's not working the way that we thought. So there's been some suggestions to refine the classes of approvals, wanting to make sure that that the regulations are consistent with agency guidelines, such as the Ministry of Natural Resources shoreline guidelines. There's been specific suggested refinements to some standards, such as lot coverage and accessory structures. For example, increasing the size a little bit of what would be allowed, because a lot of applications have been coming in not quite meeting the bylaw. And of course, accessory dwelling units. Some adjustments to legal non-conforming uses, a suggestion to add provisions for electric vehicle charging stations, bicycle parking, shared parking. You know, a lot of people want to get to Lake Simcoe, and so all of these things are important. And then also on the implementation side and administration side of things, there were specific suggestions for internal process improvements in terms of you know, staff and staff resources. Next slide, please. So why are we looking at expanding the Our Shore bylaw to expand to it on a townwide basis or other geographies within the town? So we're starting with Our Shore as a basis, updating it to, you know, look at some of these key matters that we just looked at. But we think that there's benefit in moving to a town-wide CPP bylaw, because it would allow on a town-wide basis the town to, you know, address all of these matters that I mentioned site alteration, tree removal, grading, vegetation removal, shoreline controls, all in one process. And of course, the efficiencies of replacing all of these different planning tools and creating a new system that allows for a little bit more efficient approval process and quicker approval timelines. Next slide, please. And so what we learned from our shore that we think can be applied to a townwide community planning permit system is that, of course, we'll need pre-consultation meetings with the town. So if you're coming in to propose a development, you'll need to come to the town, have a pre-consultation meeting. It will be determined then what class of permit you require, what your submission requirements are, so that all of the information is provided so that a decision can be made within 45 days. We want to, make sure that on a townwide basis, we've got clear and concise definitions. We have consistency in policy application. So, for example, the placemaking, you've got a lot of great placemaking policies in your official plan, and how do we actually bake those into a community planning permit system? And I think that there's great opportunity to do that as opposed to just a zoning bylaw. We want to have it's an opportunity to really update the town's online mapping system to more of an interactive online platform, a little bit more user-friendly, and it could be integrated into a future e-permitting system. So that's something that the town is also looking at. Next slide, please. And so just a couple scenarios here, and I won't go through them in too detail, but this is really just taking example of Priya in this case, who wants to build a garage, and what on the top half of the screen, what the process looks for Priya under the traditional process versus the bottom half of the screen, a CPPS process. And the main difference is when you look at everything, the timeline, that once you submit your application, a decision is made within 45 days on the bottom half of the screen. And then once you submit for your building permit, 10 days later, you're supposed to be issued your building permit. Whereas the top half of the screen right now, if a minor variance application was needed, you'd have, from what we're understanding, the timelines at the town right now are about 9 weeks. And then there's, no longer a third-party appeal period, but depending on how the decision goes, the applicant could appeal, which is a 20-day appeal period, and then possibly a hearing after that, and then you get into so even just on this simple application, even if it was just a minor variance, you do see a lot of process improvements. And on the next slide, we have another scenario where John would like to expand his commercial business, and this is a little bit more of a process where John would need a zoning bylaw amendment, and similar in that he gets within 9 weeks minimum, he gets a decision, for example. But after that, he needs to go for a site plan application. And even if you had started the site plan application concurrent to the zoning bylaw, you're not really finalizing the details of the site plan application until after the zoning is in place. So you've got another minimum 4 weeks. It could be several months, actually, based on just experience. And then you get to your building permit stage. So you're looking at a significantly longer process than the bottom half of the screen. Again, even though it is a bit more of a complex application than the first example that we just looked at, a decision is still made within 45 days. And that is a decision that looks at everything all at once. And for those classes that go to council, where council might not have had viewed a site plan application in the past, because all site plan applications are delegated to staff for approval currently. Under a class 3 approval CPPS, though all of those matters are combined into one, so actually council would actually see some of those detailed things about development that they might not ordinarily be part of in terms of the decision-making process. For example, landscaping along Innisfil Beach Road, and some of the requirements that might come through, a site plan application would actually be incorporated into a community planning permit system. So that's just an example of one of the changes that you would see. Next slide, please. So what we're coming tonight in terms of a recommended approach, and this will be going to council for discussion before we even move on to actually drafting the first draft of the bylaw, and then we'll have many more discussions, is really moving forward. What do we think makes sense here in terms of getting to a town-wide bylaw? So really, we do think that if you spend more time thinking about the process, so we would take, for the majority of things, the existing zoning bylaw provisions and put them into the new bylaw and update them as required. And so if you're living in a residential area and your front yard setback is 6 meters, it's likely that that's not going to change. In a CPP bylaw, that would still be the requirement. We're not looking at making those types of changes. We're looking at making changes based on things that we hear. Like an example is the electric vehicle charging stations, and maybe having additional requirements with respect to that. But we're recommending to phase in the townwide CPPS by priority area. And so starting with our shore and making sure that's updated based on the feedback that we've received. But then thinking about what the other priority areas are in town. And as each priority area is added to the townwide community planning permit bylaw, it is removed from the zoning bylaw. So right now, the town has 2 bylaws in effect. You've got the townwide zoning bylaw, and you've got the our shore bylaw. Essentially, you'd still have 2 bylaws in effect, but you would just, by priority area, move elements that are part of the townwide zoning bylaw into the community planning permit bylaw, which would include what's now the our shore. So you're still going to have 2 until the whole thing is 1. But we're not creating a third bylaw right now. This is essentially what I'm trying to say. So next slide, please. Let's talk about what the priority areas are. So priority 1 is twofold. So first, of course, is updating our shore. And we've gone through and created a paper that has some specific recommended updates. But we want to update it in a way that makes sense, that it could be part of a larger town-wide bylaw, and that once you add other priority areas into the bylaw, it all kind of jives and fits in together. So also the first priority would be including the Alcona primary settlement area. And we recommend that all lands within the primary settlement area be, included within the townwide bylaw as a priority, because this is really the town's area and primary focus for growth, and where we're going to see, and where we are seeing, the vast majority of development. Next slide, please. The second priority would be the urban settlement areas of Sandy Cove and Lefroy-Belleuert. Of course, because these are service settlement areas that are also anticipated to accommodate additional growth. And then the third priority, the remaining settlement areas of the village and the hamlets. So Cookstown, Stroud, Churchill, Fennel's Corners, and Guildford. Now I know Stroud actually might be moved up into the urban settlement area category based on the county official plan amendment now, but right now we're just categorizing them as they are in the town's official plan. And next slide, please. And then future settlement area expansions. So those areas that would be, added to the settlement areas in the town, of course, would be another priority. And then you've got the remaining towns. So the agricultural area, Innisfil Heights, rural areas. Those would be the last priority, but ultimately the goal is to have one townwide bylaw. Next slide, please. And notification requirements is something that we really we'll want to hear feedback on. And as I mentioned, it's quite flexible what the municipality can do. So that's what's great about the bylaw. So as I mentioned, there's actually no legislative requirement for any public notification for community planning permit bylaws. And some folks might say, great, let's not have any public notification. But in reality, it's important to have public consultation as part of the planning process. And so right now, if you look at our shore, for class 2 and 3 permits, so there's no notification required. That's the staff approval and the permit class where all the bylaw requirements are met. But class 1 permits that have to go to council, mail notification is provided to properties within 120 meters, so similar to other Planning Act applications. But all permit applications are posted on the town's website, so that's one way of providing notice and making sure that people are informed. And for the townwide CPP bylaws, I mentioned there's many options to consider, and expanding the notification requirement. And then, of course, thinking about how that fits into the process, given that a decision must be made within 45 days. Next slide, please. So that takes us to the end of the presentation, and we're happy to take questions. And I think we're going to ask people to type their questions in if possible, but there's actually not too many people logged into the call, so it could be that maybe if you do have a question, feel free to use the raise hand function, and maybe we can go through there. And I know it's a lot to take in if you're not familiar with the system at all, or even not familiar with our shore. But one of the good things about this is that we're really kind of embarking at on a process here where we're going to have many opportunities for input. And we've got a lot of background papers that have been prepared and a directions report that's been drafted and will be released in the near future, that everyone can read a little bit more about. So and this presentation here will also be made available. So maybe I can turn it over to Annie. I think you're going to help me out in fielding some questions, people's questions.
Yeah, thank you, David. And we actually have a question in the chat. Will Bill 97 or any other recent legislation alter this process?
That is a great question. And the answer is, of what we've seen now, so Bill 97 and other recent legislation, the answer is no. There's absolutely no change to the community planning permit process. And when you think of it, and that's been a question that was kind of at the forefront of a lot of planners' minds anyway, because of one of the things that I talked about earlier was site plan, and how recent legislation really changed the powers of a municipality with respect to site plan approval and what can be asked for essentially through that process. But all of that can still be addressed through community planning permit system. And so people are wondering, well, aren't they going to change that too? But the focus of all of the legislative changes that have occurred lately are really trying to streamline development approvals, and the community planning permit system is already a streamlined development approval process. And so no changes have been made. Now, I don't know if that is going to be the case for forever, but certainly right now it looks like it's the same. We're not having any changes to this system. So I was pleased by that. I think a lot of people are.
Thank you, David. And I just wanted to point out that we have a glitch in the system. So if you could please turn on your video and update your name if possible by clicking the 3 dots on the top right corner of your screen to rename, just so we know who we are speaking with. But I see one hand up, but I'm not sure who is raising their hand.
Hi, it's Keith McKinnon raising my hand. I had two questions. First question I have is, you mentioned early on in your presentation that about half of the community planning permits that the town has had through the shoreline has met the 45-day window. I'm curious to know what's the average timeline for the other half that have not met that 45-day window.
That's a great question, Keith. I'm gonna pass it over to Kishmita to see if you even know the answer to that question offhand. And if not, then I'd be curious to know that as well, and get back to you for sure.
Thank you, David. Can you please repeat your question?
Yeah, so early on in the presentation, it said that half of the current planning permits that are with the town, half of them meet the 45-day approval window. So what is the average timeline for the other half that do not meet the 45-day window?
At present, I cannot share the accurate number with you. What are the timelines? But mostly I can mention that the delay in some of the applications is due to newness to the CPPS system, as well as some external agency which are involved in the review of applications. But because we are going for a townwide CPPS, so we are taking this as a learning opportunity to learn from our shore CPPS and analyze what are the hurdles which are because of which there's a delay in the process timelines. So maybe we'll keep you updated on our Get Involved page, and we are coming up with a report highlighting some of the details. So I would suggest if you can please tune into the Get Involved page, and we will definitely share some of the details as we progress through the project.
Yeah, if I could just add to that really quickly. It's a great question, Keith, and one I asked as well. We have been looking to update our data and working on some smart sheets internally so that we can accurately answer that question. But what I could say is it does range quite a bit. So based on not meeting the 45 days, it doesn't mean it took 50 or 52. We do have examples where it takes several months. And what we're finding is oftentimes, because it is an integrated process and you're taking multiple processes into one, we're not trying to get any less information. And so whether you have the requirement, for example, of LSRCA or something based on the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, there might be some study requirements or some back and forth that in our experience has taken much longer than 45 days. So we don't have an accurate number to give today, but certainly we will look to be providing that. But it does take, in many cases, several months in our experience over the last couple of years to get through the process when it's a class 1 council variation. But what typically those are the ones that take longer. But what the data also shows, which is accurate, is that roughly only 5% of our applications fell into that class 1 category. So as we get into the next phase and we're building out performance standards, if we really get it right and spend the time, and we will, to really be careful with what the actual bylaw requirements are, then the hope is that whether it's class 1 or the class 2 or class 1, or whichever one is more delegated, you hope to fall within that. And really the ones that take longer are the ones that currently take longer, or because they're more complex, they have a zoning bylaw amendment, a site plan, they're still probably in many cases going to take longer than 45 days. But one thing we are going to explore in our detailed report and strategy that goes to council, but also beyond that into the next phase, is a concept of more of a provisional approval or permit. So we'll approve it in principle, but ultimately not that different than a site plan approval process. There'll be conditions or studies that have to be to the satisfaction of staff before ultimately getting final approval. And the hope is that as we get into infill and as we get into complex development, that aids well with the building permit process and including the potential for, where necessary, conditional permits. And so the tricky part, and once we spent a lot of time on this leading up to tonight, is if we're going to move away from just the shoreline, we're taking on residential, we're taking on potentially mixed use development, commercial development, for example. Well, then our general provisions, our definitions are going to be a lot more expansive than they are in our current bylaw. And so I went a little further than the data question, but I think it's important context. And I think the June report will start to answer those as well as the next phase really over the next year. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. I think it's obviously helpful that the last thing we want to do is institute a new system that's going to take longer than what the current legislative requirements are and under Bill 23. So that'll be helpful, and certainly be interested to see what that analysis shows. And I guess my second question was, as it relates to depending on what class of system you're going to be in, which will determine whether or not you're going to need a public meeting or not. Ultimately, who is going to be the deciding factor on what class you enter into and whether or not you will or will not require a public meeting for your application?
That's a great question. So the bylaw will, so for example, if you were coming in and your application, I'm just going to use a very simple application or a simple scenario where you were building a house addition and you exceeded the lot coverage by 10% of over the requirement, and you needed a front yard setback reduction, and that reduction was 10%, a 10% reduction. The bylaw could set out and would set out what the threshold would be specifically. So for those provisions, you could say, if you're seeking a 20% increase over and above, or a reduction over below whatever that bylaw requirement is, and you can set that threshold to whatever you want it to be. It could be 100%. Then you will fall within a class 2, and that would be a staff approval. But if you went beyond that, then you would end up in a class 1, which would be a council variation, because you've exceeded it by a certain percentage. You could also say if it's something that you can't measure, like if you're proposing site alteration and vegetation removal, well, that's probably something that would be good for staff to review and not necessarily something for council, for example. So that's the way the bylaw should set out and be very specific on where your application will fall in. And so applicants should be able to look at a bylaw and know, even before going to a pre-con meeting, what class they're going to be. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yep, thanks. Appreciate that.
Okay, thank you, David. And I saw that Deb Crawford has her hand up. If you would like to unmute yourself, Deb.
I am okay, thank you. I have a question. How does if the property in question has a house or a structure that's protected under the Ontario Heritage Act, how is that impacted, or how does that fit into the CPPS process?
So if you're protected under the Ontario Heritage Act, you're still bound by the bylaw that protects that heritage attribute. So that isn't integrated into the CPPS process. It's certainly something that kind of still stands on its own. So if you're coming in for an application to make a change to a heritage designated property, or a property that's within a heritage district, that will still be a factor. It'd be similar. It'd be the same way that if you were coming into for a minor variance application right now on a heritage designated property, it'd be no different than that.
So would it be the issue of dealing with the change that impacts directly on the heritage protection, and once that is resolved, at that point it moves into the CPPS process, or is it is the process a parallel one?
Yeah, I see Brandon raising his hand there. I'll throw it over to you, Brandon, if you want to.
Sure, no problem. Just the point I wanted to make is, so while there might be the Heritage Act and a bylaw that governs it, what I would say is if an application comes in for a CPPS and it had a heritage element to it, the town would have the ability to have conditions of approval or provisions within the permit itself that speaks specifically to whether it was a study, a permit, or going to the Heritage Committee. It could really, I think we have an ability to be pretty site specific and capture heritage and other concerns. It might not be just heritage, but really leverage the actual permit or the agreement beside the permit that would capture what might traditionally have been conditions of site plan approval, or something that might have been put into a zoning bylaw on a site specific basis. We could still do that and secure that through a CPPS in my mind. But it's a great question and one we might want to explore a little bit more.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And there's different ways that you could do conditional approval. You can actually issue approval or grant approval to the application and issue the permit subject to conditions, or you can grant conditional approval and that's the decision that meets the 45-day time frame, and the permit's only issued once the conditions are met. And there's different ways that you can do that, and that's probably the way that it would go for example, if it needs to go to the Heritage Committee for decision there, if there was some kind of alteration proposed. But it's a good point, Brandon. So conditional approvals is really a huge I think benefit to the CPPS process in a way that we can address these timelines.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see another person has raised their hand. Paul, if you would like to ask your question or raise your comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. You had mentioned during this process that you were looking to do some potential changes to the existing CPPS for shoreline. And you had also mentioned that there were 242 applications that went through. Curious to see, you suggested that those changes were based on feedback from the town. I would really be curious to see what the feedback from the 242 is, because that's really where it's just as important as what the town thinks.
Yeah, that's certainly a good point, and something that we can look into a little bit further, and we'll continue to receive feedback once all of these papers and the directions report is released. We'll certainly be really wanting to hear from anyone who's gone through the process, and if they have
Be more than happy to talk to you sometime.
That would be great.
Okay, thank you very much. And I see another hand that is raised.
Yes, David, I'll speak to you on 3 applications that took over a year to get permits on, and I support the shoreline, your study, anything to expedite the process. With regard to severances, I don't know if the town has done anything recently, but the applicant, when he would do a severance, he or she would have to do a geotech study. They would have to do an environmental assessment of the lot. They would have to have an arborist come in. They would have to do work with regard to the sewage treatment, with regard to the water. I've always said that's not incumbent on the applicant. That's incumbent on the buyer to do their due diligence. Have there been any changes to the conditions of approval for a severance? That's question number 1. And 2, your shoreline bylaw states that a 50-foot lot or 15.24 meter lot must have a side yard requirement of 3 meters on each side. So therefore, a 50-foot lot can only have a 30-foot product on it. Well, are you going to continue with that?
So I'll answer your second question first, and then I'll go back to the severance.
Okay, thank you.
So the second question was a specific related to side yard setback requirements. So that's, I mean, we're happy to take any comments you have on those specific provisions. The town might have a little bit more detail on or opinion on that, but we're certainly happy to take a look and see if there's changes that need to be made to those provisions based on your experience or anyone else's experience, and if there is, you know, a limiting factor on what you can do on the property.
Yeah, I can give you some examples of the 30-foot, that a 50-foot lot is now being reduced to a 30-foot product. And one, it looks terrible. It belongs in Toronto, not up here on the shoreline. Now, my first question.
Yeah, and your first question. So severances is one thing that lives and will continue to live outside of a community planning permit system. So if you are seeking a severance, you're still going to need to apply to the Committee of Adjustment to have your severance approved. Same with the plan of subdivision process. It's not part of the community planning permit system. So not something that we can address through this study.
Okay, Brandon, do you want to address that?
The severance question, not so much, because it's a little bit out of scope for tonight, but perhaps
Okay.
on another day. However, I did want to add maybe a few points on if there are setbacks or heights or any type of performance standard that you traditionally find in a zoning bylaw, or you might currently find in the shoreline bylaw, and you think it could be improved from one perspective or another. That's certainly feedback that the town wants to have. And I heard the comment earlier about hearing from people who have gone through the experience, who have gone through and pulled permits, built homes. That's meaningful data. The other thing that we're trying to build internally is a bit of a data set to see what types of variations have we been approving often, whether it be council variation or whether it be a staff variation. If they're routinely and commonly being approved, maybe it helps to inform what the correct standard might become. And so as much as the process is, and what we've talked about tonight is very much based on changing the process itself, if we find, because we are relying, generally speaking, on our current zoning bylaw standards, if we find that there's something to look at, we certainly will. And what I would say is, as we're, you know, replacing zoning with a CPPS, well, what would you normally expect from a zoning? You would expect after every OP, there's a comprehensive zoning bylaw review where you're looking at definitions, where you're looking at standards. And so as we bring forward and get into that really important phase 2 of the CPPS, I think those comments are really valuable, equally valuable to the process improvements that we're trying to make in terms of really getting as many applications within that 45-day turnaround time as we can. But for severances, generally speaking, it's out of scope of CPPS. So I won't speak to it too much tonight. Thank you.
We'll speak on another day. Thank you.
It's a good question about the provisions, though. I mean, even in my neighborhood, there's one where, and this is, Brandon, I'm sure you, with all your zoning experience in your life, you've come across similar things. But there's one in my neighborhood where there's a requirement for the second story. If you're building a second story, a lot of the homes in my neighborhood are single story. You're allowed to build a second story, but it needs to be set back from the property line by 3 feet. And there's always a variance, because from a building and construction perspective, that's not a practical thing all the time because of where the load sits. And so there's always a minor variance application, and it always gets approved. And the city is now actually going to be updating their bylaw to address that. That's just an example, speaking to what Brandon just said.
Okay, thank you, everybody. If there are no further questions, I'm going to ask if Mayor Dolan and the councillors have any questions tonight.
Thank you very much. Actually, that question about Bill 97 was my question, but I just wanted to thank you. I think we're all looking for efficiencies, and the sooner, there's 2 things: finding the right balance between the transparency and publication so that people know what's going on beside them, but at the same time also being efficient and getting people permits as quickly as possible, particularly in Canada with our building season so short. So on behalf of all of council, I want to thank you for your time, and I see a few councillors on here who might have questions.
Seeing Councilor Eisenstein, if you had a question.
Yeah, just wondering if you anticipate any differences in staffing moving to that type of system.
It's a great question. Generally speaking, no, because we're looking for efficiencies, and prior to asking for or looking at more staff, we really want to see what can we do with the current staff and how and monitor, as we transition away from traditional zoning and site plan, does it actually open capacity for process improvements where maybe we don't need to grow or add staff as quickly as you might in the traditional process. So in terms of what we're at in this work plan, the quick answer is no. But at the same time, what the CPPS is trying to do is it anticipates that we are a growth community, and with growth, eventually there will be pressure on, on staff to potentially grow with that growth. But the recommendations themselves don't result in directly at this point, at least, any identified need for additional staff or anything like that. However, and it's actually another June report, but related, as a result of all the legislative changes, whether it's the CPPS permit of the future or the traditional site plan process of today, we do have changing roles. And the best example I could come up with is the CAs, and the changing rules of the CA Act is downloading a lot of some of the honestly technical review and responsibility onto the town. And quite frankly, we may not have some of those experts, whether it might be in ecology, biology, hydrogeology. So there might be the need to look at things like peer review, using consulting, or over time, seeing if it makes sense, if the business case makes sense to add those expertise in-house. And so it is an evolving conversation. It's a great question, and a great question for a councillor to ask, because obviously I think that's something, if we're going to go down the path of changing our processes, I think that's something you'd want to understand. But I said the quick answer would be no, and then I went with a long answer, but the quick answer is no.
I see Councillor Waters has his hand up.
Thanks, Mayor Dolan. Along those lines of the downloading and eliminating the roles of the Conservation Authority, it seems that now that every municipality is going to, have to make that choice happen, whether or not they have to have that expertise and technical staff on hand, which means that every municipality could interpret the rules differently. So my question is, can you still work with the conservation authorities in terms of contract them to continue doing that work, as opposed to having to build that technical expertise, and then Barry is going to have it, or really is going to have it, Ram is going to have it. So I guess my question is, does the new legislation allow for that work still to be continued by the conservation authority? We just contract them out for it.
So as far as I'm aware, as of today, there would be, or there are limitations in doing that. However, there are and continue to be conversations between the town, LSRCA, and some of our neighboring municipalities to see how can we do this efficiently. However, the detailed answers, just quite frankly, haven't been determined at this point. And it's something that we do plan to continue to look at and actually address in a separate June report to council, or really identify that this is something that we need to manage. And in terms of whether we bring the expertise in-house, it'll ultimately be based on that the workloads and everything support that, and that's the most cost-effective and efficient way to do it. But I agree, it's not just about being efficient, it's about being consistent, especially when it comes to environmental approvals, and share the same comments and concerns. And it's something we continue to explore and it really comes down to just how rapid and how quick some of these changes have come down. That really, and it's not specific to Innisfil or Simcoe, the dust is still settling with how those roles and responsibilities will evolve.
Thank you.
Yeah, the municipalities in York Region they're obviously grappling with the exact same issues, and they're actually looking at shared resources between the local municipalities for addressing, review of EISs, which I think is very helpful because that's a great point on consistency. If you've got the kind of those individuals that are doing it, you're going to have similar or a good consistent level of review across the region, or in this case, the county. So sure, there's a solution up there.
Just kind of another question is that because we have the Lake Simcoe Protection Act, which the Conservation Authority is responsible for implementing, can they still do those roles as part of that act for municipalities, because they're still responsible for lake quality for Lake Simcoe?
I think the quick answer is that there are still some responsibilities, specifically under the LSPP, that the LSRCA remains responsible for. Yes, but not all of the responsibilities that they previously would have done.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And we have one more question in the chat. So the question is, currently with public concerns on the transparency of various levels of government, this has just closed the door to public input to pending applications. How do we leave the development of our town solely up to staff?
Well, maybe I'll start with this. So this really what we're here tonight is really starting a conversation on the development of a bylaw that we want to generate buy-into. Like, we want the public, we want stakeholders and everyone to kind of say, okay, we're creating this together and we want to arrive at something that we're all proud of and we can all work with. And part of the development of the bylaw is really the town having the ability to set what they think is an appropriate level of public involvement within the different classes. And as I mentioned, most municipalities that have implemented community planning permit systems have really built in, a good public process for review of applications. So as we continue on to the study, if there's any issues or concerns about when we get into the details of the bylaw and, oh, well, this shouldn't really be delegated to staff, well, and we'll have that discussion and we'll see if there's any concerns that need to be addressed. So I just encourage you to remain involved in the study, and public participation now through the development of the bylaw is important.
And if I could just add one point, the traditional process, we're here tonight talking about CPPS, the traditional site plan process, generally speaking, doesn't have a public meeting. And so generally speaking, if you met the bylaw, you wouldn't even need a minor variance in terms of the model of today. So when you look at the model of tomorrow, and even if you look at our current shoreline bylaw, the current CPPS, where you don't meet the standards, where you have a significant variation, there is still that public process. We do still have that council meeting for class 1 variations. And one might argue it's actually a higher threshold of public consultation than site plan is actually able to achieve based on the recent changes in Bill 23 and some of the other legislative changes. And so I think what the next phase, it's a great question, because what the next phase has to answer is based on which class or which class of permit you're in, what are the notice requirements? What are the requirements for a public meeting? And the town, quite frankly, has the option to go above and beyond, but might choose to very strategically. Because in my mind, if you're doing more complex mixed-use development, the pre-consultation process, as well as the approval process, should have a lot of public consultation. But if you're pulling a permit, a CPPS permit for a shed, and the shed would have otherwise complied to the zoning bylaw traditionally, then I would say maybe there shouldn't be too much of a notice or public consultation requirement. The same way there wouldn't be today. You would go to the building department and pull a permit. And so the scale of development, I think, is really important. And within that scale, you'll have really those detailed questions. And we're only at a strategic phase. We're at the point of bringing a strategy forward to start to ask these really important questions, so that when we build the bylaw, chapters of that bylaw will be very specific, but also predictable for a developer or for someone who wants to do development as to what the notice and public consultation requirements are. So maybe I'll leave it there, but certainly it's an evolving conversation and one we do require input, and likely we'll get a balance of opinion depending on which stakeholder you are. But I appreciate the question. Thank you.
Thank you for the great discussion tonight. And I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to move on to the next steps slide.
Thanks, Annie. So yes, we're gonna continue on in the process, entering into the next phases of the study. But before we get there, you know, we have if you could go to the next slide, please, Annie. Actually, we'll go. Can I go to one more and then I'll come back to this one? I should have switched the order of these ones, but as you can see, we're kind of at the end of the phase one, starting entering phase two and phase three. Phase two is the development of the draft bylaw. I'm mixing that up. Phase two is the placemaking and sustainable development guidelines. Phase three is the development of the draft bylaw. They're to be conducted both phase two and three concurrently, for good reason, really wanting to make sure that people understand what the guidelines say and what the bylaw says. That's going to be work that we do through the summer and the fall of this year. And so we're going to have more opportunities for public involvement before moving to the final bylaw and likely official plan amendment, and then ultimately final approval. So lots of opportunities for input going forward. And if you go back to the previous slide, we've got an online survey that's on the Get Involved Innisfil page that you see here. If you don't have the ability to write this down right now, you just have to remember Get Involved Innisfil and type that into Google, and you'll see a link there to the CPPS project, and you could fill out the survey to provide some feedback. And of course, if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to Kishmita at the town, and her email is right here. And that is it. Thank you all very much. I don't know if anyone from the town wanted to say any last words, but thank you all. I really appreciate hearing all that you had to say. And Mayor Dolan and members of council, thank you for attending tonight. Look forward to seeing you at the end of June.
Thanks. Have a good rest of the evening.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.